Hi Reddit, I'm Alex, 30M, and I've been carrying a lot of emotional baggage for years. I wasn't planning to post this, but here I am, hoping someone can make sense of the mess I call my life. Growing up, I always felt like I didn't belong. My parents, Richard and Melanie, were ambitious, career-driven people. My dad was a corporate lawyer who was always handling important cases, while my mom was jet-setting around the world running some big financial company. They didn't have time for much else, least of all for me. Most of their energy went to my older brother, Jason, who was everything they wanted in a son. Jason was the golden child. He was always getting awards, excelling in sports, and winning accolades at school. He was the captain of the football team, and every family gathering revolved around his achievements. I was the exact opposite. Anything I did, no matter how hard I tried, wasn't good enough. If I got a B on a test, I'd hear about how Jason had gotten straight A's. If I tried to join a sports team, I'd get a sarcastic, "Are you sure you can handle that?" from my dad, as though it was a joke that I'd even try. At school, things were just as bad. I was the kid everyone picked on, too skinny, too awkward, too easy a target. I'd get shoved into lockers or mocked for being a loser. I learned early on to keep my head down and not expect much. Home wasn't any better. If my grades didn't measure up to Jason's, spoiler alert, they never did, I'd get grounded. And when I say grounded, I don't mean losing TV privileges for a weekend. I mean locked in my room for days, sometimes a full week. They'd bring me meals, but that was it.
No anteraction, no explanation.
Just hours alone staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done to deserve this. I can still remember one specific time when I was 12. I had spent weeks working on a science project about volcanoes, something I was actually excited about. When I finally presented it at school, I won second place, which, to me, was a huge deal. I ran home, trophy in hand, and showed it to my parents. My mom glanced at it, muttered, "That's nice," and went back to her laptop. My dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. Later, Jason came home with another football trophy, and they practically threw a party for him. I went back to my room that night and cried until I fell asleep. That's the first time I remember thinking, I don't matter to them. I never will. The constant comparisons made me hate Jason. He wasn't mean to me, not exactly, but he didn't stick up for me either. He didn't have to. He was too busy being perfect. I'm sure he knew how my parents treated me, but he never said anything about it. Looking back, I don't know if he even cared. By the time I hit high school, I'd pretty much given up on trying to win their approval. What was the point? Nothing I did was ever going to measure up. Instead, I started focusing on just surviving. I kept to myself, buried my nose in books, and avoided my parents as much as possible. I started working part-time jobs after school. Not because I needed the money, but because it gave me an excuse to stay out of the house. Anything was better than being there. Even now, as an adult, those feelings haven't gone away. I still struggle with self-doubt and this nagging sense that I'll never be good enough. Relationships are hard for me because I don't trust people easily. How can I, when the people who were supposed to love me the most couldn't even bother to see me? Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get past it. Anyway, that's the first chapter of my life. There's a lot more to the story, and things definitely don't get any simpler from here. When I turned 20, I thought I was finally escaping the suffocating grip of my parents. I got into a decent college 500 miles away from home, and for the first time I felt a spark of hope, like maybe I could finally start living my own life. But, of course, freedom wasn't something my parents were willing to let me have. I had dreams of pursuing something creative, photography, maybe graphic design. I loved the idea of capturing the world in a way that spoke to people, but my parents weren't having it. They sat me down and told me in no uncertain terms that I was going to law school. "We're not paying for you to waste your life," my dad said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do something practical for once." The message was clear. My dreams didn't matter. So I caved. I didn't have the guts to stand up to them, not when they were the ones footing the bill. I enrolled in pre-law and tried to convince myself it wasn't so bad. But I hated every second of it. The classes felt lifeless. The pressure was suffocating. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living someone else's life. Then, everything changed the night I met Rachel. It was at some random college party I almost didn't go to, but something pulled me there. Rachel was vibrant, the kind of person who lit up a room without even trying. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when she talked to you. I don't know how it happened, but we just clicked. For the first time in my life, someone saw me. Not Jason's brother. Not the disappointment. Just me. Rachel became my anchor. She encouraged me to think for myself and reminded me that it was okay to dream. She believed in me in a way no one else ever had. With her, I started to feel like I could finally break free from the expectations that had been suffocating me for so long. But, of course, my parents found out. They never liked Rachel, not that they gave her a chance. My mom called her a distraction. My dad said she'd ruin my future. It didn't take long for the threats to start. If you don't break up with her, we're cutting you off, my dad said one night over the phone. No tuition, no money, nothing. I was trapped. They knew exactly how to control me, and I didn't have the courage to fight back. So I did what they wanted. I broke things off with Rachel, even though it felt like ripping my own heart out. She didn't understand, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I couldn't even bring myself to explain the real reason why. After Rachel, everything spiraled. I couldn't focus on school anymore. Every lecture felt meaningless. The weight of it all, losing Rachel, living a life I didn't want, the constant pressure, pushed me into a dark place. I started drinking, first just to take the edge off, but it quickly became a crutch. My grades tanked, and eventually I dropped out. My parents were furious, of course, but I think part of them felt vindicated, like they always expected me to fail. Looking back, I know I made a mess of things, but at the time I didn't know how else to cope. My whole life had been about living up to other people's expectations, and the one time I tried to make my own choices, it all fell apart. I wish I could say things got better from there, but honestly, that was just the beginning of the chaos. By the time I turned 25, I was done trying to fix things back home. Dropping out of college had been the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with my parents. My dad said I was a failure, and my mom just sighed like she couldn't even muster the energy to be disappointed anymore. Jason, of course, was thriving. He'd graduated top of his class from some Ivy League school and was already climbing the corporate ladder. I couldn't compete with that, so I stopped trying. One day, I packed everything I owned into my old car and drove 1,000 miles away. I didn't have much of a plan, but I knew I needed a fresh start. I ended up in this small town where no one knew me or cared about my past. Felt like a clean slate. I got a job at a local bookstore. Nothing fancy, but it was peaceful, and I actually liked being surrounded by books. It felt like the first step toward rebuilding something, even if I didn't know what that something was yet. It was around this time that I finally decided to try therapy. I'd been avoiding it for years, partly because of the stigma and partly because I wasn't ready to face my past. But after everything I'd been through, I knew I couldn't keep running from it. That's how I ended up in Dr. Griffin's office. He was an older guy with kind eyes and a way of making you feel safe, even when you were talking about the darkest parts of your life. Therapy wasn't easy. For weeks, I just vented about my childhood. How my parents always put Jason on a pedestal. How nothing I did was ever good enough. How they'd controlled every aspect of my life. Dr. Griffin didn't say much at first. He just listened. But over time, he started challenging the narrative I'd been telling myself for years. "Alex," he said one day, "you weren't the problem. Your parents made choices that hurt you, and that's on them, not you." That was a turning point for me. For so long, I'd carried the weight of their disappointment. Like it was my fault I couldn't live up to their impossible standards. Dr. Griffin helped me see that their behavior wasn't about me. It was about them and their own issues. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. For the first time, I started to let go of the guilt and shame I'd been carrying for years. With that newfound clarity, I started thinking about what I actually wanted out of life. I remembered how much I'd loved graphic design back in high school before my parents had crushed that dream. So I decided to give it another shot. I enrolled in some online courses, spending my evenings after work learning the ins and outs of design software and building a portfolio. It was tough juggling work and classes, but for the first time in years, I felt excited about something. After a few months, I started freelancing. At first, it was just small gigs, designing logos for local businesses, creating social media graphics. But the more I worked, the more confident I became. Eventually, I landed a full-time job at a marketing company. It wasn't a dream job, but it was a huge step forward. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was on a path that I had chosen, not one that had been forced on me. Looking back, moving away and starting over was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also the best decision I've ever made. Therapy helped me untangle the mess of my childhood, and graphic design gave me a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And honestly, that felt like a victory. Life took a turn I never saw coming after I met Mark. He was one of those people who just radiates positivity, always upbeat, always ready to push you to do better. We met at the gym where he worked as a trainer. I wasn't much of a gym guy, but I'd been trying to take better care of myself, so I started going a couple of times a week. Mark and I hit it off right away. He had this infectious enthusiasm for fitness, and before long we started hanging out outside the gym. One night over beers, Mark told me about an idea he'd been kicking around. A fitness and health app designed to make personal training accessible for everyone. He wanted something that wasn't just about working out, but also about nutrition, mental health, and overall well-being. Fit Life, he called it. He said he'd been looking for someone to help him bring it to life, and when he found out I was a graphic designer, he practically begged me to join him. At first, I wasn't sure. Starting a business from scratch sounded risky, especially since neither of us had much money. But the more we talked about it, the more excited I got. Mark had the fitness expertise and I had the design and marketing skills. Felt like we were the perfect team. So we pooled our savings, built the app, and launched it 6 months later. To our surprise, Fit Life took off. At first, it was a slow burn, just a few downloads here and there, but word started spreading and soon we were getting thousands of users. We reinvested every cent we made back into the app, improving features and expanding our reach. Within a year, it was a full-fledged business, and I couldn't believe how far we'd come. With the success of Fit Life, I started feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world. I wasn't just some guy who couldn't live up to his parents' expectations anymore. I was building something meaningful, something that was helping people. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I deserved to be happy. That's when I decided to reach out to Rachel. I'd thought about her so many times over the years, but I'd never worked up the courage to contact her. After the way I ended things, I wasn't sure she'd even want to hear from me. But something about where I was in life now, stable, confident, finally proud of myself, made me feel like it was time. I found her on social media and sent her a message. It was short and simple, just an apology for how things had ended and an invitation to catch up if she wanted to. To my shock, she responded almost immediately. We started talking, and before long we were meeting up in person. Seeing Rachel again after all those years was surreal. She was still the same vibrant, compassionate person I remembered, but she'd grown in ways that made me admire her even more. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed. I told her about my struggles, my therapy, and how I'd finally started building a life that felt like mine. She told me about her own journey, how she'd become a teacher, and how she'd always wondered what had happened to me. It didn't take long for things to fall back into place between us. We started dating again, and within a year we were married. The day I saw her walking down the aisle was the happiest moment of my life. Not long after, we welcomed our daughter, Liana, into the world. Becoming a father changed me in ways I can't even put into words. Holding Liana for the first time, I promised myself I'd never make her feel the way my parents made me feel. I'd love her for who she was, not for what she achieved. And with Rachel by my side, I felt like maybe I could finally break the cycle. If you told me a few years ago that I'd end up here, successful, married to the love of my life, and a dad, I wouldn't have believed you. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. I still carry the scars of my past, but for the first time, I feel like I've truly healed. And honestly, that feels pretty damn good. Just when I thought life had finally settled into something good, my parents showed up out of nowhere. I hadn't spoken to them in years. Not after I dropped out of college. Not after I moved across the country. Not even when FitLife became successful enough to make headlines in our industry. I figured they were done with me, and honestly, I was fine with that. So when I saw their names in my email inbox one morning, I didn't know what to think. Their message was as cold and calculated as I remembered them being. They demanded $250,000 as compensation for my upbringing, claiming they'd spent years investing in me and deserved to be reimbursed for their efforts. They also wanted a share of FitLife, insisting that since they'd funded my early education, they were entitled to the success I'd built. It wasn't a request. It was a demand, complete with the thinly veiled threat of legal action if I didn't comply. First, I laughed. The audacity was almost unbelievable. But as I read their email again, anger bubbled to the surface. After everything they'd put me through, the neglect, the constant criticism, the complete lack of support, they had the nerve to show up now and act like I owed them something? I deleted the email and tried to move on. But the very next week, I was served with legal papers. They were suing me. Rachel was furious when I told her. "They have no case," she said, pacing the kitchen while I sat at the table, trying to process everything. "They can't just demand money for raising you. That's not how parenting works." She was right, of course, but that didn't make it any less stressful. The thought of going to court, of dragging my childhood into the public eye, was almost too much to handle. But I knew I couldn't let them bully me anymore. I had to fight back. The trial was one of the most emotionally draining experiences of my life. My parents came prepared, armed with lawyers and documents outlining every expense they'd ever incurred while raising me. School tuition, clothes, food, everything. They painted a picture of themselves as loving parents who had sacrificed so much for an ungrateful son. It was sickening to watch, but I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. When it was my turn to speak, I told the court everything. I talked about the years of neglect, the way they'd prioritized Jason over me at every turn, how they'd forced me into a life I didn't want and punished me for not measuring up to their impossible standards. I shared stories I hadn't even told Rachel, about being locked in my room for days, about the times they'd ignored my achievements, about how they'd torn apart my relationship with Rachel all those years ago. It was like ripping open old wounds, but I knew it was the only way to show the judge who they really were. Dr. Griffin even testified on my behalf, explaining the lasting impact their treatment had on me. He talked about the depression, the anxiety, the years it had taken me to rebuild my self-worth. Hearing him validate my experiences was both painful and cathartic. For the first time, I felt like someone truly understood what I'd been through. The verdict came down after what felt like an eternity. The judge ruled in my favor, stating that parenting is not a transaction and that my parents had no legal right to demand money from me or a share in my company. He even admonished them for their behavior, calling their actions manipulative and selfish. Watching my parents' faces as the ruling was read was a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Part of me had always hoped they'd change, that one day they'd see me for who I was and not who they wanted me to be. But as I left the courtroom that day, I realized that wasn't going to happen, and that was okay. Rachel and I celebrated that night, not because we'd won, but because it felt like I'd finally closed the door on that chapter of my life. For years, I'd let my parents' expectations and criticisms define me, but standing up to them in court, telling the truth about what they'd done, felt like taking back my power. I wasn't their failure or their disappointment anymore. I was me, a husband, a father, a business owner, and someone who had finally learned to let go of the past. A few months after the court case, just when I thought I could finally breathe again, things took an even darker turn. It started with a phone call from my sister, Jessica. We'd never been particularly close, mostly because she'd always been in Jason's orbit, soaking up the same golden child glow that seemed to follow him everywhere. Unlike Jason, though, Jessica had a sharp edge to her. She was quick to anger, and over the years, her bitterness toward me had only grown. The call started off tense. She accused me of humiliating the family during the court case and said I had no right to air our private business. Her voice was shaky, but there was something underneath it. Anger? Sure, but also something more unstable. I tried to keep my cool, explaining that I had only told the truth. That's when she hung up on me. I didn't think much of it until a few days later, when Jessica showed up unannounced at my office. I barely had time to process her being there before she lashed out. She pulled a telescopic baton from her bag and started swinging. The first blow hit me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled backward, trying to shield myself, but she kept coming. "You ruined everything," she screamed as she struck me again. "You destroyed this family." The pain was excruciating, but her words cut even deeper. I'd always known Jessica resented me, but this was something else entirely. As she kept swinging, she blurted out something that froze me in place, even as I tried to dodge her blows. "You're not even one of us," she spat, her face contorted with rage. "You were adopted, Alex. You're nothing but a mistake my parents took pity on." Her words hit harder than the baton ever could. Adopted? I hadn't seen that coming. It was like the ground beneath me shifted, and suddenly nothing about my life made sense anymore. Why hadn't they told me? Was that why I was treated so differently, like I was never enough? Before Jessica could do more damage, a coworker heard the commotion and rushed in, pulling her off me and calling the police. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was barely conscious. My ribs were broken, my arm was fractured, and I had cuts and bruises all over my body. The pain was unbearable, but my mind was spinning too fast to focus on it. All I could think about was Jessica's words. In the hospital, Rachel stayed by my side, holding my hand as I tried to piece everything together. The adoption bombshell consumed me. I couldn't stop wondering who my biological parents were and why I'd been given up. Did they love me? Did they even want me? It was like my entire identity had been thrown into question. The police arrested Jessica, and I filed charges, though it wasn't an easy decision. As much as I hated what she'd done, a part of me still saw her as my sister, or at least, someone I'd once hoped could be. But after everything, I knew I couldn't let her get away with it. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Lying in that hospital bed, broken and bruised, I realized I couldn't let this go. If I was adopted, I needed to know the truth. I needed answers, not just about my biological parents, but about how it all tied back to the life I thought I knew. Rachel promised to help me, and even though I was terrified of what I might find, I knew I couldn't move forward without uncovering the truth. This revelation wasn't just a shock, it was a reckoning. My entire life had been shaped by parents who treated me like an outsider. Now I had to wonder if that's exactly what I'd been all along. A year after Jessica's attack and the bombshell about my adoption, life still felt like I was trying to piece together a shattered mirror. My ribs and arm had healed, but the emotional wounds were slower to mend. I started searching for my biological parents, but it was like chasing ghosts. I hit dead end after dead end, and part of me began to wonder if I'd ever find answers. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a letter. The handwriting was neat but shaky, and the return address wasn't one I recognized. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a name, Margaret, my birth mother. She'd found me. The letter was both an apology and an explanation. Margaret wrote about how she'd been young and struggling when she got pregnant with me. She'd been in an abusive relationship, barely scraping by, and knew she couldn't give me the life I deserved. "Giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done," she wrote. "But I did it because I loved you and wanted you to have a chance at a better life." Reading her words, I felt a flood of emotions. Relief, anger, curiosity, and sadness all at once. She'd given me up because she thought it was the right thing to do, but the life I ended up with was far from what she'd hoped for. Still, her words didn't feel like an excuse. They felt honest. I decided to respond. Our first meeting was awkward but meaningful. Margaret was older than I expected. Her hair streaked with gray and her hands worn from years of hard work. But her eyes lit up when she saw me, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of myself in her expression. She hugged me like she'd been waiting for it her whole life. Over the next few months, I got to know her better. Margaret wasn't perfect, but she was genuine. She'd spent years wondering about me, terrified I'd hate her if we ever reconnected. It was strange to think about how different my life might have been if things had gone another way. But I realized that I couldn't hold her past choices against her, not when she was trying so hard to make amends now. At the same time, something unexpected happened. Jessica reached out. She wrote me a long letter, apologizing for everything. She admitted she'd been jealous and angry for years, feeling like I'd stolen attention from Jason and disrupted the family dynamic. But seeing how far things had spiraled, especially after the attack, had forced her to confront herself. "I was wrong," she wrote. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Took me weeks to decide whether or not to respond. Part of me wanted to cut her out of my life completely, but another part remembered the girl she'd been before our family fractured. A girl who might have been just as lost as I was. So I wrote back. Slowly, cautiously, we began to correspond. It wasn't easy, and trust didn't come quickly, but over time, I started to see a different side of her. Margaret, Rachel, and Jessica were all in my life now, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something real. Something not weighed down by the ghosts of my past. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the scars from my childhood ached. But it was progress. And after everything I'd been through, progress felt like a victory. A few years later, life looked completely different. Rachel and I had built something solid, something I never thought I'd have. A family that felt whole. After Liana came the twins, Olivia and Nick, and if I thought being a dad to one child was life-changing, being a dad to three was a whole new adventure. The twins were full of energy and mischief, constantly keeping Rachel and me on our toes. They each had their own quirks. Olivia was creative but struggled with reading, while Nick was analytical but shy in social situations. Rachel and I made a promise early on. We'd be the kind of parents who showed up. No matter what our kids needed, we'd be there to support them. When Olivia's reading difficulties became apparent, we worked with her every night, finding ways to make learning fun instead of frustrating. With Nick, we helped him build confidence, encouraging him to join group activities where he could thrive. Seeing them grow into their own unique selves was the most rewarding thing I'd ever experienced. At the same time, my career was evolving in ways I hadn't imagined. FitLife had become a stable success, but I'd started dreaming of something bigger, something that combined everything I'd learned about fitness, mental health, and resilience. That's how Balance Pro was born. It wasn't just another fitness app. It was designed to address the whole person, blending exercise routines with mindfulness exercises, stress management tools, and even journaling prompts. Building Balance Pro was a labor of love. I poured everything I'd learned from therapy, life experiences, and the challenges of running FitLife into its design. Mark came on board as my co-founder again, and we recruited a team of mental health professionals and fitness experts to make sure the app was as effective as it was user-friendly. When we launched, the response was overwhelming. People connected with the idea of an app that didn't just tell them how to work out, but also how to take care of their minds. Between the success of Balance Pro and the joy of raising my family, I finally felt like I'd found peace. Rachel and I made a point to keep our marriage strong, carving out time for date nights and open conversations, even in the chaos of raising 3 kids. Margaret became a regular part of our lives, too, coming over for holidays and birthdays. She was Grandma Margaret to the kids, and the warmth she brought to our family felt like something I'd been missing my whole life. Jessica, too, found her way back into the fold, though things were slower with her. We kept our conversations honest but cautious, rebuilding trust one step at a time. Over time, I came to see her remorse as genuine. She even apologized to Rachel directly, which went a long way in repairing some of the damage she'd caused. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come. From the kid who thought he'd never be good enough to the man I am now. I still have moments where the past creeps in, where I hear my parents' voices in my head telling me I'll never measure up. But then I look at Rachel, at our kids, at the life we've built together, and I know they were wrong. For the first time, I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving. And honestly, that's the kind of happiness I never thought I'd find.